Have you ever like stopped and really thought about how crazy it is that your brain just like figures out the world, you know? Like,
Mhm.
I mean, seriously, there's just like this constant flood of information hitting you, right? From all your senses, sights, sounds, smells, everything, right?
Yeah,
But like you don't have to like consciously think about putting it all together. It just like happens automatically.
it really is remarkable when you put it that way.
Right. So how does that even work? Like how does the brain take all that raw input and just create this like this whole reality that we experience?
Yeah, that's a question that neuroscientists have been grappling with for, well, I mean, forever, really.
Hmm.
And it feels so effortless for us, doesn't it?
Totally. And speaking of this whole like figuring things out thing, there's this theory I came across recently that I just like had to dive into. It's called the free energy principle or FEP.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and get this, it was developed by this like brilliant neuroscientist, Dr. Karl Friston. And the really cool thing is there's been some like really solid experimental validation of it recently. So like this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack what this FEP is all about and really dig into how it's like changing the way we think about how our brains learn.
It's a timely discussion, for
Hmm.
sure. I mean, for years now, we've seen these like huge advances in artificial intelligence, particularly in machine learning, but they've kind of hit a wall in some fundamental ways, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Like, think about it. These AI systems, they need just like mountains of data to work, right? And then even when they work well, it's often really hard to understand how they actually got to their conclusions. Like, we call it the black box problem.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this ongoing debate, is it truly intelligent or is it just really sophisticated pattern recognition? It's not quite the same thing, right?
Right. And that's what makes this FEP approach so interesting. It's a totally different way of looking at intelligence, both for us and for potential AI, you know? So, in this deep dive, our goal is to really get to the heart of what the FEP is all about and understand why this recent proof is such a big deal. Not just for understanding our own minds, but like for the whole future of AI, too. And, this deep dive was actually inspired by some awesome resources that you, our listeners, shared with us. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, let's think about the sheer scale of what our brains are dealing with every single second. You mentioned this flood of information, and it truly is like an ocean, just this massive amount of data constantly hitting our senses.
It's kind of overwhelming when you think about it like that.
Right. And our brains somehow manage to filter through all of that, extract what's important, and make sense of it all.
So, like, think about trying to follow a conversation in a really noisy, crowded room, or like trying to pick out a friend's face in a huge crowd. That's what our brains are doing all the time, right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
And it's not a simple task at all. It's like trying to solve this incredibly complicated puzzle in reverse. The world throws all these effects at us, the sounds, the sights, and our brains have to figure out the hidden causes. What's making that specific sound? What's causing that particular pattern of light that our eyes are picking up? It's like being a detective, but you only have the clues and you have to work backward to figure out the crime.
And to make it even more complicated, the same underlying cause can produce wildly different effects depending on all sorts of things, right?
Precisely. Like think about recognizing someone's face. That same face can look totally different depending on the lighting, their expression, the angle you're seeing them from, all sorts of variables. But our brains still manage to like instantly recognize that it's the same person.
It's mind blowing.
It is. And this is where the free energy principle comes in. This theory proposes that our brains aren't just passively absorbing all this sensory data like a sponge. Instead, it suggests that our neurons are constantly generating these, what we call top-down predictions about what they're going to encounter. It's like our brains are actively trying to guess what's going to happen next, to explain away the incoming sensory data before it even fully arrives.
So it's like our brains are making these mini hypotheses about the world all the time.
Exactly. And those predictions aren't always going to be accurate.
Right.
And that's where learning comes in. When there's a mismatch between our predictions and the actual sensory input we receive, that creates what's called a prediction error.
A prediction error.
Yeah. And those prediction errors act as a signal to the brain that its internal model of the world, its current best guess about how things work, isn't quite right.
So the brain uses those errors to learn and improve its predictions.
Exactly. It's constantly updating its beliefs, refining its internal model so that it can make better, more accurate predictions in the future. You can think of the brain as this incredibly sophisticated inference machine constantly trying to figure out the best explanation for the sensory data it's receiving.
So it's not just about reacting to what's happening, but more about proactively trying to understand the underlying causes, the why behind everything.
Precisely.
That makes a lot of sense. And, it's interesting because for a while, the FEP was this really compelling framework, but there wasn't much direct experimental evidence to support it. Like,
Mhm.
it made sense theoretically, but it was hard to prove that this was actually how brains were working at a fundamental level.
Yeah, you need that real-world validation,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And that's where this amazing research out of the Riken Research Institute in Japan comes in. They actually managed to get some really solid experimental proof for the
It
SEP.
was a groundbreaking study.
Totally. So, like, tell us more about this study. What did they actually do?
Well, they started by creating these miniature controlled networks of neurons using cells from rat embryos. Essentially, they were working with these tiny, simplified versions of brains in a dish.
Wow, that's wild.
It is, right. And then they delivered these patterns of electrical stimulation that were designed to mimic auditory sensations.
Mm.
Like, imagine you're listening to two different speakers talking at the same time. That kind of complex, mixed audio signal. They replicated that for these little neuron networks.
So it was like they created a miniature, simplified version of a noisy environment for these brain cell culture.
Exactly. And initially, the networks reacted kind of randomly, which is what you'd expect from a system that's just starting to form and hasn't learned anything yet. But then, over time, something really remarkable happened.
What happened?
These initially chaotic networks started to self-organize. They began to selectively respond to one of the simulated speakers or the other, filtering out the noise from the other speaker. It was as if they were learning to tune into a single voice in a crowded room, just like we were talking about earlier.
So they were actually able to separate out those mixed sensory signals and identify the likely sources, even though they'd never encountered anything like that before.
Exactly. And the most compelling part, this self-organization wasn't just random. The researchers compared the way these biological networks structure themselves to computer models that were based on the free energy principle. And guess what?
They matched.
They matched perfectly. The biological networks were organizing themselves in a way that was completely consistent with the predictions made by the FEP-based computer models. They essentially reverse engineered the computational models that these living neuronal networks seemed to be implicitly using. It was like they had cracked the code of how these networks were learning and adapting.
So they could actually predict how the learning would unfold just by applying the free energy principle.
Precisely. And they also saw that the mismatches between the network's internal state, its expectations, and the incoming sensory data were causing changes at the synaptic level, the connections between neurons. These synaptic changes were essentially fine-tuning the network's internal model of the world, making it better at predicting what was going to happen next.
So it was this constant feedback loop, right? Prediction, error, update, repeat.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They wanted to test the theory even further. So they used these special drugs to temporarily change the activity of the neurons. They could make them either more or less likely to fire, kind of mess with their normal functioning a bit.
And what happened when they did that?
Well, the FEP predicted that these changes would affect the learning process in a very specific way, and that's exactly what they observed. By disrupting the network's internal models, they could actually control how the learning process unfolded. It was like providing even stronger evidence that the FEP was indeed the guiding principle behind how these networks were learning.
So it's not just a theoretical concept, it's actually how real brains work.
Precisely. And one of the lead researchers on the project, Takuya Isamura, put it really well. He said, I'm quoting here, "Our results suggest that the free energy principle is the self-organizing principle of biological neural networks."
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. And it has huge implications, not just for understanding our own brains, but also for the future of AI.
Absolutely. Because if we can figure out how to build AI systems that learn and adapt in the same way that our brains do, using these principles of the FEP, that could be a real game changer.
It could. And, Dr. Friston, the guy who came up with the FEP, is actually the chief scientist at a company called Versus AI. And they're doing some really fascinating work in this area. They're developing what's called active inference AI.
So active inference AI, how is that different from the kind of AI that we're used to hearing about, like machine learning and all that?
Well, traditional AI is very data-driven. You need these massive data sets to train the algorithms. And it can be really computationally expensive. Active inference AI, on the other hand, is inspired by how biological systems learn. It's all about using Bayesian inference, like our brains do, to constantly update and refine internal models of the world.
So it's not just about passively processing data, it's about actively making predictions and learning from the results.
Exactly. And it's much more efficient, too. Active inference AI systems can learn from much smaller amounts of data, and they can adapt to new situations more quickly.
It's like they're more curious, more proactive in their learning.
In a way, yes. They're not just waiting to be fed information. They're actively seeking it out and testing their predictions against the world. And that's a big part of why people are so excited about the potential of active inference AI.
So, we've talked a lot about these internal models that our brains create, but how does that actually work in practice? Like, what does an internal model even look like?
That's a great question. And it's one that researchers are still trying to fully understand. But we can think of an internal model as a kind of simplified representation of the world. It captures the relationships between different things, the causes and effects, the patterns and regularities, and it allows us to make predictions about what's going to happen next, even in new and unfamiliar situations.
So, like, if I see a ball rolling towards me, my internal model of physics tells me that it's going to keep rolling unless something stops it.
Exactly. And your internal model allows you to predict where the ball's going to go, how fast it's going to be moving, and even what's going to happen if you try to catch it.
So these internal models are what allow us to navigate the world, make decisions, and plan for the future.
Precisely. And that's what makes the free energy principle so powerful. It provides a unifying framework for understanding all sorts of different cognitive processes, from perception to learning to decision-making.
And it also has huge implications for AI because if we can build AI systems that have these sophisticated internal models, they'll be able to do so much more than just pattern recognition. They'll be able to actually understand the world, reason about it, and make intelligent decisions.
Exactly. And that's why this recent experimental validation of the FEP is so significant. It suggests that we're on the right track. We're starting to understand the fundamental principles that underlie intelligence, and we're starting to build AI systems
Yeah.
that are inspired by those principles.
It's a really exciting time to be following this field. And, for our listeners who want to dive deeper into this, there are some great resources available online. Versus AI, the company that Dr. Friston is involved with, has a really informative website. You can find them at versus.ai.
And for those interested in the broader context of how this might all fit together in the future, the Spatial Web Foundation is doing some really interesting work on creating this kind of shared, intelligent digital space, the sort of metaverse for AI. You can check them out at spatialwebfoundation.org.
And Denise Holt, she's got this awesome blog where she breaks down all these complex AI concepts in a way that's really easy to understand. You can find her at deniseholt.us.
Oh, fantastic resources.
So I guess the big question that this all leaves us with is if our brains are essentially prediction machines, constantly shaping our perception of reality based on our internal models, what does that say about the nature of reality itself? Like, is reality even objective, or is it just a construction of our own minds?
It's a deep philosophical question, and one that I don't think we have a definitive answer to yet. But I think the free energy principle gives us a really interesting new perspective on this whole debate. It suggests that the reality we experience is, at least in part, a product of our own expectations and predictions. And that's a pretty mind-blowing idea to think about.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the free energy principle. Until next time, keep those brains predicting.
Always.